Thank you and welcome to Ujima Wednesdays. November is Revolts and Revolutions Month at Ujima. More than a forcible toppling of governments and social order, revolutions are an intellectual endeavor, a spiritual one. Angela Davis once said, we have to talk about liberating minds as well as liberating society. And so with that, we are super excited to welcome Professor Gerald Horne. Dr. Horne holds the Morris Professorship of History and African American Studies at the University of Houston. His research has addressed issues of racism in a variety of relational ways involving labor, politics, civil rights, international relations, and war. He has written an extensively about film history, the film industry, and Dr. Horne received his PhD in history from Columbia University, his JD from the University of California, Berkeley, and his BA from Princeton University. So we're so excited to have you here, Dr. Horne. And I pass the mic to you.
Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me. I'm highly appreciative. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm going to speak for a few moments on the origins of the United States of America. And my major point is that there is a volcanic-like eruption taking place with regard to how scholars, historians, and even activists are beginning to view the origins of the United States post-1776. This kind of rewriting and revisioning of history is not unusual. Some of you may be familiar with W.E.B. Du Bois, who of course spent some of his pivotal years in Boston and Cambridge. And in the 1930s, he wrote a book called Black Reconstruction, which revised the traditional understanding of the period following the US Civil War, known as Reconstruction. Those of you familiar with the film Birth of a Nation, which is a love letter to the Ku Klux Klan, may recall that it embodies the traditional interpretation of Reconstruction up to Du Bois publishing his book in the 1930s. That is to say, a period of Negro corruption and deviltry and all of the rest, whereas Du Bois took another point of view, portraying it as a period of democratic possibility. Today, we're seeing a similar sort of rewriting and revisiting of history. There are those in your audience who I'm sure are familiar with the work of Nicole Hannah-Jones, now of Howard University, in her 1619 project, which suggests that the origins of the United States should not necessarily be looked at as 1776, but at the time of the Africans coming in to what is now called Virginia. Of course, she alludes to the point that the founding of the United States was somehow forged by slave owners like George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, etc. And other historians have known for decades that by several orders of magnitude, the Black population did not necessarily support the ouster of London from North America, just like in 1812, when there was another conflict between London and the infant United States of America. Black people participated in the sacking of Washington, D.C. in August 1814. That particular episode, amongst others, led to the national anthem of the United States and its notorious third stanza, castigating the Black population because of its supposed lack of patriotism. But it's not just Nicole Hannah-Jones. You may be familiar with the Indigenous studies scholar Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz of the San Francisco Bay Area, in her Indigenous Peoples History of the United States, or her recent book, Not a Nation of Immigrants. You may be familiar with the late scholar Tyler Stovall, his book, White Freedom, as the title of his book suggests, the freedom that was promised by 1776 did not necessarily extend to all of the denizens of North America. And then you have traditional established scholars like Woody Holton of University of South Carolina, who's just written a book revisiting the origins of 1776 or revisiting the origins of the United States. Robert Parkinson of Binghamton University doing the same. Black intellectuals like Ishmael Reed of the San Francisco Bay Area. You may be familiar with his spoof of the Disney come Broadway extravaganza Hamilton, which he sees as being rather loose with the facts in terms of stressing the purported abolitionist bona fides of the founders of the United States of America. Now, I could go on in this fashion, but I think the point should be clear that a number of writers and scholars are trying to construct a history that may shed light on the current moment being the rise of a prison industrial complex, the promiscuous police shootings of Black people, which seems to happen on an all too regular basis. And this attempt to have a past that sheds light on the present is nothing new in terms of US history. You may be familiar with the book by the late Yale scholar C. Van Woodward, The Strange Career of Jim Crow, coming out in the 1950s, consistent with the rise of the anti-Jim Crow movement, which tried to suggest that Jim Crow had very shallow roots, Jim Crow, of course, being the system of US apartheid. And having shallow roots, the inference being that the roots could be more easily taken from the ground. I should also say that from a broader point of view, 1776 should be seen contextually. There is scholarship that suggests that the so-called Glorious Revolution in England, 1688, which led to the clipping of the wings of the monarch, leading to King Charles today not exercising the kind of power that monarchs before 1688 exercised. Scholars are suggesting that what was lurking beneath 1688 was the fact that the merchant class wanted to get in on the lucrative nature of the African slave trade, which has been and was one of the most profitable enterprises known to humankind. You could invest $1 and get $1,700 back. And there are those today, perhaps, who would sell their firstborn child for a 1,700% profit. And 1688, the so-called Glorious Revolution, was successful in allowing the merchants to elbow their way in to the lucrative African slave trade. And as I will show in a minute, 1688 led directly to 1776. That is to say, the exponential rise in the arrival in the Americas of enslaved Africans, which kicks off a chain of events that leads to a revolt of slaveholders in North America and their enablers in 1776. And then you may know that I just wrote a book on Texas. Texas's origins come from a secession from Mexico in 1836 after Mexico, under a president of African descent, speaking of Vicente Guerrero, moved to abolish slavery. The slaveholding class, led by Sam Houston and Stephen F. Austin and other freebooters and pirates who then affixed their names to major cities, were not having it, so they seceded from Mexico and established yet another slaveholding republic in North America that went on to try to challenge the United States, both in North America and certainly outside of the United States, for control of the African slave trade. And then we know about 1861, and everybody seems to agree, well, most people seem to agree, I should say, that when the southern states, including Texas, sought to secede from the United States in 1861, that slavery was a motive force, a driving factor. They were defeated by 1865, and then that leads ultimately to the defeat of the enslavement project in the hemisphere, up to and including Brazil in 1888. And then there's 1776, which you should see as fitting within that schematic. That is to say that leading up to 1776 and the revolt of the slaveholding class was 1772, Somerset's case, which abolished slavery in England in 1772, a point so notorious that there's a useful film that I would recommend to you entitled Belle, B-E-L-L-E, starring Gugu Mbatha-Raw. Some of you might have seen it, which provides a sort of fictionalized historical backdrop to Somerset's case. There was a fear that Somerset's case would leapfrog the Atlantic, jeopardizing fortunes in enslaved Africans. Before Somerset's case in 1772, there was the so-called Royal Proclamation by London in 1762-63, whereby London cast doubt on its continuation of defeating and fighting indigenous groupings, so that real estate speculators like George Washington could then profit by seizing their land. These are two of the pivotal events that undergird my book, The Counter-Revolution of 1776, which suggests that the formation of the United States of America was based upon enslavement of Africans. Interestingly enough, the Florida governor, Ron DeSantis, who may be challenging Donald J. Trump to be the Republican nominee for president in 2024, during his successful campaign for re-election, said, like many of our liberal friends and scholars, that it was actually 1776 that helped to give a boost to abolition of slavery. If that hypothesis is correct, it was a rather strange boost, since the number of enslaved Africans in North America was in the thousands in the 18th century and was in the millions by 1861. This was a very strange abolitionist project, not to mention the fact that in terms of slave traders, as early as the 1790s, shortly after the founding of the United States, US slave traders were basically controlling the slave trade to Cuba. One of the reasons why Cuba has such a substantial Black population is because of the manic energy of US slave traders. This was a very strange abolitionist project indeed. Some point to the notion that during the war with London, 1776 to approximately 1783, that you had some states in New England, such as Vermont, that moved to abolish slavery. But I think you should look at that skeptically. That is to say that historically in North America, there has been an anti-slavery tendency, not necessarily an abolitionist tendency. What I mean is that the Vermonters did not want Negroes at all. No enslaved Negroes, no free Negroes. That's one of the reasons why Vermont today has one of the smallest percentages of Black populations in these United States of America. If you fast forward to the 1850s and you see Oregon entering the Union, they took a similar posture, which has been interpreted by blinkered historians as abolitionists. That is to say, no enslaved Negroes. That's where you get this idea that they were abolitionists, because they said no enslaved Negroes. But they didn't want any free Negroes either, which is one of the reasons why today Portland, Oregon has one of the smallest Black populations of any major US city, because of course, after entering the Union, the Portlanders and the Oregonians were assiduous in terms of trying to keep Black people out of the Pacific Northwest. And then to return again to the international scene, it's quite curious that the abolitionist United States, in the so-called abolitionist United States in the 1840s, was responsible for the fact that you had an exponential rise in Brazil, which has the largest Black population outside of West Africa, outside of Nigeria. One of the reasons for that great, substantial Black population in Brazil is, you guessed it, the manic energy of US slave traders in the 1840s. Indeed, one of the wrinkles on the exponential increase of Black people in Brazil in the 1840s was that the US ambassador to Brazil during that time, Henry Wise, who, by the way, you may recognize his name because he was governor of Virginia in 1859 when the great John Brown was executed after trying to lead an armed revolt against slavery. Well, Henry Wise was against these US slave traders going into Angola and Mozambique and dragooning Africans and dragging them into Brazil. I guess some of the blinkered historians would say that makes him anti-slavery too. Well, one of the reasons that he was against that particular enterprise is because states like Virginia, his native Virginia, not to mention Maryland, were moving into the slave breeding business. There's been a lot of research lately on what is called the means of reproduction. That is to say, the rather casual exploitation of Black women as sort of breeding engines. And the idea is that Black people would be bred like racehorses and bulls and shipped from North America down to Brazil. So this is the inglorious history that sheds light on the inglorious present. And unlike some of the histories that our children are subjected to, and not to mention young adults at universities in the Boston area, they are subjected to a kind of misleading hypothesis and thesis that does little good in terms of trying to explain the prison industrial complex, why Black people are treated so horribly today, and why even before last Tuesday's election, even the US president was talking about the United States perhaps tipping over into fascism, which of course would have been a nightmare in the first instance for the Black population. Now, after having laid out that background, let me reel back. Before 1776, reel back to the origins of the settler colonial project in North America, which in a sense begins in 1565, when the Spanish, who had a first mover's advantage because they sponsored Christopher Columbus, established a settler project in what is now St. Augustine, Florida, and shortly after that in New Mexico. And so in other words, I think it's fair to say that if you're really intent on understanding settler colonialism, you may want to reel back before the Mayflower, before Virginia in 1607, and go back to the 1500s. But what's interesting is that as the Spanish Catholics were seeking to establish this foothold in Florida, they saw as a major challenger to their increasing global position the Ottoman Turks, the Muslim powers. And indeed, the Muslim powers also saw the Catholic powers, led by the Iberians, the Spanish and the Portuguese, as their major challengers. Interestingly enough, you may recall that it was in 1517 that Martin Luther, not Martin Luther King, Martin Luther seceded from the Catholic Church, that this leads to the Protestant faith, quote unquote, the Protestant sect, as it was called then. It's adapted and adopted by London in the 1530s, which kicks off a chain of religious wars between the Protestants and the Catholics. And by the way, in terms of our discussion, we may want to touch upon the point that just as you see a surge of racism, particularly anti-Black racism in the United States, you're also beginning to see signs of religious bigotry, the kind of religious bigotry that was quite commonplace in the 1500s. Indeed, if you look at your news, you'll find that an official in the state of Georgia, the US state of Georgia, was recently quoted as making anti-Catholic remarks. Some of us have thought that anti-Catholicism had been on the retreat in the United States in recent decades. In any case, what happens is that the underdogs, the scrappy underdogs, speaking of Protestant London, basically cuts deals with the Muslims against the interests of their fellow Christians, speaking of the Iberian Catholics. And that helps to explain why we're sitting here in North America speaking English today in 2022. And I can go into how that process unfolded during question and answer, or you can look at my book on the 16th century, The Dawning of the Apocalypse, or you can look at my book on the 17th century, The Apocalypse of Settler Colonialism. So what that means is that when the English are trying to establish their settlement in what they call Virginia in 1607, the Spanish in Florida were hotly opposed, but they were so busy fighting the indigenous population and the Africans, they had enslaved Africans too, of course, that they were not able to sail northward to contest the English settlement, which is one of the reasons why John Smith and his comrades were able to establish a foothold in North America, then replicated due north in what becomes Massachusetts. Now, I should also mention that if you fast forward once again to the 18th century, it would be appropriate to suggest that what happens following the so-called Glorious Revolution of 1688, when, as noted, you have the merchants entering the African slave trade in large numbers, it leads to an exponential rise in the number of Africans crossing the Atlantic. But many of them were not happy to be dragooned and forced to work for free. It leads to slave revolts in New York City in 1712, slave revolts throughout the Caribbean shortly thereafter. You have Stonewall's Revolt in South Carolina in 1739 by enslaved Africans, assisted, by the way, by the Spanish in Florida. You have another slave revolt in New York City in 1741. So finally what happens, and this is where your traditional narrative of the founding of the United States makes a bit of sense, is that in 1756, London decides that it has had enough. It seeks to oust the French from due north in Canada. Recall that you had Frenchmen implicated in these slave revolts in New York City. There's not that much difference between Quebec and New York if you look at your map. And as noted, you had Spanish in Florida who were implicated in Stonewall's Revolt, as already suggested. So you had the so-called French and Indian War, the 7 Years' War, 1756 to 1763. The Londoners were able to oust the French, or at least France, from Canada, leaving in its wake a restive Quebecois community that is still the majority in Quebec, due north of New York City. And temporarily, they were able to oust the Spanish from Florida. And then, once again, the traditional narrative picks up. They go to the settlers and the colonists and want them to pay taxes. But perhaps because these settlers are so dependent upon enslaved labor, free labor, they're accustomed to getting things for free. So they're not interested in paying taxes. And so that leads to an incipient revolt against London, spurred on, as noted a few moments ago, by the Royal Proclamation of 1762, 1763, and Somerset's case of 1776. So there you have it. This newer interpretation of the founding of the United States that seeks to explain how and why it was that Black people in particular were not necessarily engaging in class collaboration, standing shoulder to shoulder with slave masters so that the slave masters could bring more enslaved Africans across the Atlantic. Why that happened not only in 1776, but it happened again in the War of 1812. It happened throughout the 19th century. Indeed, one of the least commented on themes of US history, and not least Black history, is how Black people in North America have been forced to make alliances with the real or imagined foes of Washington in order to advance. Some of you may be familiar with the thesis that the way to understand the retreat of Jim Crow in the middle of the 20th century, US apartheid, was because the United States was enmeshed in a Cold War with the socialist camp. The United States was trying to portray itself as a paragon of human rights virtue. At the same time, it was treating a significant percentage of its citizenry with utter contempt. At the same time, you had African nations and Caribbean nations surging to independence who were looking askance at the United States as a model for development and were leaning towards the socialist camp. That creates a dynamic that leads to the agonizing retreat of US apartheid, Jim Crow. Indeed, Chief Justice Earl Warren of the US Supreme Court mentions this global context in the epical Brown versus Board of Education decision in 1954. But as you probably also know, there was a grassroots revolt against desegregation represented in Little Rock in 1957, in Oxford, Mississippi in 1962, in your own Boston, the purported Athens of North America during the busing desegregation crisis of the 1970s, in Yonkers, New York, housing desegregation, represented, by the way, in another useful film, Show Me a Hero, which I highly recommend, which captures the tensions. And then, of course, you can see another grassroots revolt at the polls in 2016 that leads to the election of Agent Orange. And of course, he plans to make a comeback in 2024. So if we're going to understand history, if we're going to understand these tumultuous events, if we're going to try to move away from this idealized pap that passes for history, that's spoon-fed to our youth in order to mislead them so that they won't understand the prison industrial complex, so they won't understand police terror, so they won't understand US interventions all over the world, so they won't understand US support for apartheid, pre the election of Nelson Mandela in 1994, once again, we have these scholars, activists, and historians who are trying to present a newer interpretation, and that's what I tried to present to you this early evening of November 16th, 2022. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Horne. That was amazing. I'm going to ask everybody if you have a question, you can drop it in the chat. Tamashi says, PDF of Brown 2, second edition, funded by the Boston Ujima Project, Ashe grant. Yes, we are studying the Brown 2 case during Tamashi's Arts and Culture Organizing, Arts and Culture Organizing mini workshops. So yes, questions for Dr. Gerald Horne. Okay, I see a lot of thank yous. I see a lot of thank yous. And we'll drop the link for Tamashi's project as well. I do have a question. So I have seen you speak at length in different podcasts, and I was wondering if you could give us maybe an abbreviated version of the relationship between 1776 and US fascism today. Is that like too long of a conversation for us to answer in the next like 20 minutes or no? And we do have
Well,
other questions.
I can give you the executive summary. The executive summary being that you may have noticed that during the course of my remarks, I used this phrase class collaboration. That is to say, I said that the enslaved Africans did not engage in class collaboration. And in fact, despite many of our friends on the left affixing what they consider to be the insult of identity politics to describe what is actually a descending version of class solidarity amongst enslaved Africans. That's why the descendants of enslaved Africans tend to vote against the right at a higher rate than any other demographic, oftentimes 8-2 or 9-1, as expressed in the most recent election this past Tuesday. However, class collaboration has been at the essence of settler colonialism. If you look at my book on the 16th century, for example, and you look at my telling the story of the 1580s, when England first sent colonists across the Atlantic to try to occupy what they call North Carolina, it was a typical class collaborationist project. That is to say, poor Europeans, along with the 1% in London, uniting across class lines for mutual benefit, i.e. seizing the land from the Native Americans and ultimately stocking it with the free labor of enslaved Africans. If you look at January 6, 2021, the attempted coup, once again, class collaboration, mostly people of your descendants of settlers of European descent, including CEOs flying in on private planes, shopkeepers, military veterans, simple workers, etc. So if fascism does arrive in the United States, it will arrive being buoyed and born by class collaboration. That is to say, the kind of class collaboration you saw on January 6, 2021, the kind of class collaboration you saw in the 1580s in what London called North Carolina. And I'm afraid to say that major victims of fascism will be the community that oftentimes shuns class collaboration, speaking of the Black community, which is continuing to express and exude a kind of class solidarity, particularly in trying to repel the incursions of the neo-fascists and the right wing.
Thank you. I do see some questions here. One from Tamasha. Do you want to ask it out loud?
I think Dr. Horne already just covered it about class collaboration among insurrectionists on January 6th, but I am typing out another question about what happens when there is collaboration with, I try not to sound like hyperbolic, but contemporary acts of fascism when we look at police violence toward Black and Indigenous and other communities of color. What are we seeing when we see Black and Indigenous and other people of color participating in those groups that are acting out state-sponsored violence on their own communities? That one kind of leaves me at a loss. I was wondering if you could talk about that.
Well, as the example of Clarence Thomas on the US Supreme Court, amongst others, tends to suggest, class solidarity is not universal. It's not existing at the level of 100% amongst the melanin rich, amongst the descendants of enslaved Africans. This too is nothing new. If you look at the history of slave revolts, Gabriel's revolt in Virginia in 1800, it was basically betrayed by other Negroes. Ditto for Denmark Vesey's attempted uprising in South Carolina about 200 years ago, betrayed by other Negroes. So this is nothing new. And in fact, you may suspect, understandably, that that kind of betrayal, that kind of turning one's back on class solidarity will increase during the 21st century unless and until we are able to create organizations and resistance that discourages that kind of betrayal and class collaboration. But once again, what I'm trying to suggest to you is that the political expressions in the Black community are a result of history, that is to say, being descendants of an enslaved population, which routinely engaged in class solidarity, and also an expression of today's reality, where there is a recognition that class solidarity is very important in terms of trying to lessen the terror that is routinely inflicted upon the Black community in the first instance.
Thank you. We have Nina next. Nina, I can read yours out loud, or you can read it yourself.
Well, I'm happy to speak, and apologies for being off camera. I'm kind of running back and forth between my office and the kitchen to feed the cats. Cats have to be taken care of while I do my learning. So the question, Dr. Horne, and I have read parts of your book, the Counter-Revolution book, and from other scholarship. I'm a legal scholar myself, so I'm familiar with the Somerset case. I'm familiar with, because most legitimate legal scholars recognize that it had a strong role in influencing the Southern colonies, in particular, in joining the Northern colonies and challenging, England and the British Empire and engaging in civil war. So I'm familiar with that, but I'm less familiar with the Royal Proclamation. I don't recall that being spoken about as much in the book. If you could just maybe provide a little explanation of the 1862-1863 Royal Proclamation and then its influence on sort of the evolution of making to 1776. That would be super helpful.
Yes, the Royal Proclamation of 1762, 1763. And before I get to that, let me advert to the point you made about feeding your cats, because it ties into a contemporary point. You may have noticed that the latest fable about the ultra-right wing, which led to a victory in Oklahoma for the man who was going to oversee education, is that children, this is meant as a slur on the trans community, that children are now identifying as cats, and that they're asking for litter boxes to be placed in classrooms. Believe it or not, the person who is going to be administering education in the state of Oklahoma used that theme, apparently, to win. And I think that this bespeaks the kind of hysteria that's gripping the United States of America, the kind of defamation that's gripping the United States of America. And hysteria and defamation oftentimes go hand in hand with the rise of neo-fascism. Now, with regard to the Royal Proclamation, what happens is that London was expending blood and treasure, fighting Native Americans as the settlers were moving west across the continent. London had its hands full of fighting on the European continent. It had its hands full contesting and contending with its perpetual antagonists across the channel, speaking of France. So it was willing to try to cut deals with the indigenous population. Native American scholars, by the way, such as Roxanne Dunbar-Ortiz, are making a big deal about this Royal Proclamation. And of course, this is followed when London fundamentally tries to overthrow the United States in 1812, where London was fighting shoulder to shoulder with many Native American groupings against the settlers, including the great warrior Tecumseh, who died during the War of 1812, fighting shoulder to shoulder with the Redcoats. So this is part of the newer vision or revisioning of the early history of the United States of America. And I'm happy to say that the more writers and scholars are joining this movement, which I think bodes well for the future of this country.
Thank you, sir.
Gio, you want to ask your question out loud, or you want Sierra to read it, or one of us to read it?
I'm happy to ask it out loud. Thank you for inviting me, and very nice to meet you, Dr. Horne. My question is, it's also in the Zoom chat as well. In the age of, quote, Black celebrities type a sentence online and undo the progress of Black revolutionaries sometimes within a week of publicity, end quote, how do we overcome this betrayal and continue building the movement for self-determination for Black people in solidarity with the Native American struggle? I kind of heard you touch upon some elements of this earlier.
Well, solidarity with the Native American struggle is going to be critical. And once again, that requires a revisioning of history. In my latest book on Texas, which covers the slavery period and the post-slavery period, I point to this contradiction in Black America during the post-slavery period. Whereas on the one hand, in East Texas, and by the way, Texas has the largest Black population in the United States of America, for reasons I can go into if you're interested. But in East Texas, post-1865, you had a reign of terror inflicted upon the Black population. Texas was also always in the vanguard in terms of lynching, extrajudicial, extra-legal executions of Black people without due process of law. However, in West Texas, you had Black soldiers, the so-called Buffalo Soldiers, who were at the tip of the spear when Native American resistance was crushed. And I think that if we're going to talk about revisioning US history, we're going to have to revisit the inglorious history of the Buffalo Soldiers and the inglorious history of how Black soldiers, Black male soldiers for the most part, if not exclusively, were involved in human rights violations against Indigenous populations. And I think that that's important for a number of reasons, not only because I think solidarity is built upon truth and honesty, but also it should come as no shock or surprise that today even there might be a tendency erupting of using one targeted group against another targeted group, which is basically what happened post-1865 in the US Southwest. So that's my brief response to your question. And certainly, I think that for the Native American population and for the Black population, and by the way, the Cherokee are now negotiating to have one of their treaties implemented, which would grant them non-voting representation in the US Congress today, tomorrow. And perhaps if we begin to look at the other treaties that were negotiated with Indigenous groupings, we'll find similar kinds of provisos, which would then allow for certain kinds of alliances on Capitol Hill between the Congressional Black Caucus, whose numbers are growing, and the Native American representation, whose numbers may be in the process of growing.
Thank you very much. And I'm also going to review the literary references as well. Thank you again.
Mm-hmm.
Lise, do you want to say your question out loud?
Yeah, sure. Nice to meet you, Dr. Horne. So my question follows up actually on Gio's question. And I was wondering if you have any recommendations on how organizers can be proactive in protecting their movements from those betrayals, especially when organizing virtually and it's harder to build trust the way you might have. And, so even though folks were able to be in person and build deeper trust, there was still a lot of potential for betrayal. What are your recommendations for us now in this virtual space?
Well, that's a very difficult question because as I'm sure you know, COVID has not disappeared. In fact, it's been complemented, so to speak, by flu and other opportunistic viruses, which makes it very difficult. But that makes it very difficult for us to come together under one roof. But having said that, I do think that I would like to see a revival of a trend that was quite prevalent when I had less gray hair than I do today. And that trend, of course, was study groups. I was able to come to maturity at a time when people considered themselves to be revolutionary. Many people in my generation then considered themselves to be students of world politics, not just students of US politics. So therefore, we studied incessantly. There were collectives that came together to read various works and then discuss face to face. Perhaps if that were to happen today, you would discuss it like this, but still, I don't think my voice is muffled. So I think you could probably still understand me. And likewise, I think that what we tried to do was engage in mutual solidarity. That is to say that we had Native American groupings who were joining picket lines in support of the Black liberation struggle and vice versa. You had a Black Panther Party that was complemented by the Brown Berets from the Chicano movement, the Mexican-American movement. You had solidarity with our brothers and sisters in Indochina, which is one of the reasons why that war came to a screeching halt in 1975. So I think that the ultimate answer to your question is the ultimate answer to many questions, which is that we need to accelerate study and we need to accelerate organizing.
Thank you so much.
Nia, I saw that you had your hand raised.
I put it back down and I see that Charles has a question in the chat.
Okay, Charles, would you like to answer your question out loud, or would you like it to read it for you?
Sure, I can go ahead and read it. And I apologize if it's a little bit uninformed, but I'm just wondering, Dr. Horne, if you can speak to the role that the music plays in moving us forward, meaning Black American music. The types of exploitation that you spoke about in Jazz and Justice persists. And even through platforms like Spotify, the jazz scene or the mainstream jazz scene is perhaps whitewashed. Yet it still feels like Black American music contains a blueprint for struggle and is a form of study. And I just wonder if you could talk to us about that.
Well, thank you for the question. Charles Wallace Thomas IV is referring to my book, Jazz and Justice, Racism and the Political Economy of the Music, which was published a few years ago. It's an attempt, among other things, to show how music was helping to propel mass movements at a certain point. I won't rehearse or repeat all the examples that I cite in that book. Let me also say that at a certain point, musicians' unions were very important, just like unions generally are very important. One of the deficits in my remarks thus far has not been emphasizing and stressing the role of unions, organizations of working class people coming together for mutual solidarity and mutual benefit. That happened as well with regard to jazz musicians. That also involved not only coming together for mutual benefit in unions, it also meant musicians contributing their art and their skill to mass movement. You're probably familiar with the work of the late, great Max Roach, who, by the way, spent some of his latter years teaching at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst. Some years ago, he was involved in fundraising activity on behalf of anti-Jim Crow movements. The same could be said for the late, great pianist, bassist, composer, Charles Mingus. In fact, if you look at my book on Southern Africa, one of the themes that will leap out from the pages of that text is how, in building solidarity with the movement in Southern Africa, we had, speaking of activists on this side of the Atlantic, we had substantial support from musicians, not only musicians like Abdullah Ibrahim, the late Dalla Brand, who of course was of South African origin, but all sorts of musicians in the United States of America, particularly Black American musicians, but not exclusively Black American musicians. So music has an important role to play, and given the fact that the Berklee School of Music is within stone's throw, I imagine, of where some of you are sitting, it gives even more reason for Bostonians and Bay Staters to be joining hands with musicians for mutual solidarity and mutual benefit.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gerald Horne. I hope everybody gives a round of applause. Thank you so much for sharing with us and for speaking with us. This has been such an incredible session. You know, if y'all have any more questions for Dr. Gerald Horne, you can drop them in the chat and perhaps we can try to get them answered later. But unfortunately, it is time for us to end. So I'm gonna say thank you again and goodbye to YouTube.